So it's often a really surprising thing that if you were to make a map of the wealthiest and poorest nations on the planet and you color coded them based on wealth, you would essentially be mapping with those same colors population growth. And we would imagine that wealthy countries, people can have more children, and poor countries, um, it must suck to be there, so people would have less children. um, it's counterintuitive to many of us. It is for me. And there's like really powerful forces that create this pattern, but I have to caution you, these are largely foreign to most of us. So I want to list those 5 things that are on your screen now, but I want to challenge how you think about it. And then I have some follow-up stuff that I think is more important than these 5 things. Number one, in general, scarcity tends to disenfranchise women. Societies with less stuff to go around seems to, on an average, globally mean that women don't get a share of those scarce resources. As an evolutionary biologist, I should warn you that there's a lot of interesting and sometimes insulting and absurd explanations for why this is. But as a general rule, when you have scarcity socially, women tend to be kicked to the edges of society, and a lack of decision-making power, and not being legally autonomous, or not having like a personhood that lets you be your own woman, means that you really don't control your body. My wife can damn well decide how many kids she has, right? um, in our society, it would be pretty tough, and it would not be comfortable for me to like get pushy about that. But of course, that's one of our many privileges. That's just how and where we live. It would be different, I think, if she were socially disenfranchised, if she couldn't go to the police, if she couldn't get a job, if she couldn't open a banking account, then this sort of takes away your right to take a stand. Um, in a whole bunch of societies, women are just an attachment and even a property of men, especially in poor societies. Number two, in poor parts of the world, there is, speaking generally, limited access to medicine. And it's not just limited access to birth control. I need to convince you to think about your life differently. Like my 11-year-old, if he like sprains his ankle riding his scooter in the backyard, can like come to tell us, his parents, that he wants Advil because like he doesn't want it to be sore tomorrow morning. And I'm not arguing that that's a good strategy for me to medicate my son or to let him medicate himself. But I mean to say that we all manipulate our bodies all day long. And that's a practical, normal thing in our culture. If you have a headache, you know what to do. If your teeth are crooked, you can get that fixed. If you have an infection, you can ask for the pills to get rid of the infection. Imagine a world where humans are just stuck with their body and you don't have medical intervention of any type. You break your arm and you got a crooked arm. You get like a scratch on your face and maybe you get an infection and your eye falls out and you're a one-eyed person from then on. It's amazing to consider that for you and me, medical intervention is not only available culturally, but is something that we understand intellectually and something that we pursue all the time. Now imagine parts of the world where there is no medical intervention, dentist, doctor, veterinarian, none of that. And so the concept of controlling your fertility is just as foreign as controlling how crooked your teeth are or controlling your back pain. There's many languages in the world that don't have a word for back pain, because if you can't do anything about it, then it doesn't even merit conversation. It's not even a word. Number three, poor people tend to start earlier. It's called early age of first childbearing. You can see that's underlined, and you should know that that's a technical term. So that's vocabulary. I should have put parentheses on that. Early age of first childbearing means that women who don't have education and then don't have the option of a job and then don't have the option of economic autonomy, when that child becomes a young woman, she's ready to play ball, so to speak. If parents have been struggling to feed this child, it's like, oh, thank God, my daughter is now a young woman. If she gets married, maybe we can find a man for her that'll feed her better than we can. Maybe we can find someone who will provide for her better than we can. Maybe that lets us focus on our other children. And for that young woman, being married at an early age means getting away from mom and making the transition to the rest of her life. If there isn't the option of like high school and then college and then like a volleyball career or whatever, then for that young woman, you could start breeding. I don't know about you personally or women in your life, but 12, 13, 14. And basically, when a woman is very young, it's very easy to get pregnant and very likely that the pregnancy will be successful, that the baby will be carried to full term, that the delivery will be successful, that the baby will be healthy, that mom will be healthy afterward and ready to have another one. What's interesting is women have a finite fertility window from basically first ovulation until menopause. And the number of eggs in there is fixed. When a woman is in the uterus, when she's a fetus, her number of eggs are determined. And those eggs are going to drop pretty much every 28 days, give or take, out of that woman until the well runs dry and she can't have any more kids. Now, what's fascinating is that the fertility at the very beginning is exceptionally high and starts to taper pretty fast. It gets steeply worse. I'm not an expert. 40s or something, I don't know, but maybe you've heard that women get to an age where they have a lot more trouble getting pregnant. And like my wife, what was it, like late 20s, when we had our first kid, we tried for like 11 months or something, and we were like focused on it. It like took some attention. When a woman's like 13 or 14 or 15, you sneeze wrong, pregnant. Those first years really make a big difference. And so, if you can just stay busy during those early breeder years, total fertility goes way down. Now, there's some cultural stuff that you need to remember. We talked about this in previous videos. If you've had historically high death rates, birth rate doesn't really seem like an important variable, right? Like my great grandmother had 13 children and everybody she knew had about, teens, 10 to 20 kids. Like it's a long life, and no birth control or nothing, but those babies were always dying. Babies would die, teenagers would die, adulthood is pretty sketchy. So in a population where 18 out of 20 die, well, however many you can have, that's not going to seem like a big deal, and population wouldn't grow. You have very few surviving to adulthood. Now, death rates are easy to fix in an era of global development. Since the Green Revolution, for example, global death rates have been coming down like crazy, and the birth rates just haven't lowered with them. Imagine if my great grandmother had her 13, by the way, I think it's 14. If my great grandmother had her 14 actually children, and none of them die, then holy mackerel, that's going to be some big population growth. And if each of those doesn't really have a concept of birth control, right? Doesn't really think of this as a problem, they're just going to have however many kids they crank out, then each of her 14 kids has on average around 14. You can imagine population growth would really take off. And so in many poor parts of the world, death rates came down a little while ago, but birth rates haven't caught up. They're just accustomed to high birth rates because high death rates were historically common. You may remember we talked about the demographic trap, where population growth accelerates. Finally, there is a thing among some parts of the world where extremely poor people need more workers for the fishing boat or for the shrimp farm or for the cornfield or whatever. It's called the labor effect. And a lot of families will consciously generate more offspring because you reach a scale at which it's easier to survive if there's more people working on one endeavor. If you have more miners for your mine, then all of a sudden you can keep up with the erosion or whatever. I don't know. Now, those 5 are famous, well-known correlations between poverty and population growth, but there are a few things that I need you to keep in mind. I want you to make sure that you have these things in your notes. First of all, everybody knows how babies are made. We do this thing where our decisions in our society about having children are exceedingly different. The richer you are, the more different they are. And so when you and I look around, we're like, come on, you crazy poor person. Why are you having so many babies? You can't even feed them all. And like, we can't quite relate. And as a matter of fact, we tend to say things that are sometimes really absurd and condescending and perhaps unfair. For example, nobody needs education about how babies are made. Like, nobody needs to learn how the baby comes out of mom, like everybody knows the birds and the bees part of this. Some people don't understand the options about birth control, but we don't need to like educate these poor people about where babies come from. That would be incorrect. Make sure you don't say that. Write that in your notes, please. Number 2, and this might be interesting for you, poor people everywhere have those same 5 issues. This stuff, especially the disenfranchisement, but the limited access to medicine, the early age of first childbearing, and even the historically high death rates, this applies to poor people everywhere, including the United States, including Santa Barbara, probably including this class. I don't want to put anybody on the spot, and I don't want to make anybody feel bad, but this is not something which is trapped in poor parts of the world. Poverty goes everywhere, and high birth rates go with poverty. You go to the poorest parts of the United States, and those are the parts where people have, because those kids probably have the least access to opportunity after school. Those kids probably have the most limited access to medicine. Those families probably have the earliest age of first childbearing, because for a lot of poor people in the United States, if college is already out, then, you know, maybe if high school's already out, then maybe start earlier. So remember that this is a universal thing that's attached to poverty, not to poor places, but to poverty wherever poverty is. Number 3, we can't even imagine the reality of the world's poor. Many of us who are poor by American standards are not poor by global standards. And I don't want to diminish your struggles. I don't mean to do that. But it's really amazing how I have to assume that all of you have access to birth control. If you needed to chase it down, you could probably text a friend and have it at your house by tonight. I think that, you know, among most of you in your peer group, I don't think anybody's like desperate to get married so that they can get into that stage in their life. Not at your age. But globally, I have met many women younger than you who are like eager to get married. You know, most of us are drowning in choice. You have choices of other stuff to do today and other stuff to do after school, and you've got choices for what to do over spring break and over summer. And you know, even before you reached reproductive age, you probably had choices, and after reproductive age, you still have choices. So most of us think of parenting strategically. You start a family when the time is right. And this is a difficult moment for you to take notes on this, but I do need you to let me talk about my family, because I need to talk about my wife and me, and then I need to talk about my mom and my dad, because I think it illustrates something, and I think that's important. My wife, I always knew I wanted to have kids. I grew up with a bunch of cousins. I love babies. I played with dolls when I was a young boy. I always wanted to be a dad. My dream when I was your age, I was like 25, start my family, like my father did at 24. I never hid that plan from my wife. She was kind of on board. As we got closer to our mid-20s, we're both like, yeah, you know, we should probably get a couple things together. It seems like reliable medical care is really important. It seems like having a good job where I'm not going to be worried about my income next year, that would be nice. And so my wife and me, we kind of like, we did the stuff, you know, we did adulting. We did pretty good adulting. We both, you know, got out of college. We made some money. We like paid down our debt, made sure we both had cars. We like bought land in the mountains and started homesteading, and we had chickens and we had dogs and we had hobbies and we were fit. And we're like, all right, career, you know, teaching program. We both became teachers in Santa Barbara. That's pretty hard to do. You got to be kind of a big deal to get a job in Santa Barbara as a teacher. That's just saying. We like taught for a few years. We're like, all right, is it time? Let's do this thing. And like, we had planned it for, I don't know, close to a decade together, like eight years, something like that. I really don't remember, but it was a good number of years. It was like a big part of our plan. And then like we were always talking about what the ideal spacing would be for the next kid. And then after 2, we like both wanted 3, but it's kind of difficult in today's economy, and like environmentally, we sort of wondered if that would be the right thing, and like talked it all out. Decided one day, no, we're good. We like surgical procedure for dad. And, you know, we like managed this. This was all under control. I have to assume for most of you, it'll probably be kind of similar. We are privileged people. Forgive me, but I got to tell you about my parents. They got married when my mom was young, like less than 18. They were both pretty successful by the standards of their time. My dad was a grad student and my mom was like a good college student. They met at university in a country where not a lot of people go to university. Their parents were both, very poor and kind of worked their way up. They were like, you know, both of my grandfathers were like proud men. They did righteous things in their community. Right after my parents got married, there was a military dictatorship, and my mom and dad went on the run. And they were hiding from the military, and people would chase them down and assassinate their friends, and people were getting tortured and disappeared all over the country. And my parents had to keep running. They were on lists, maybe you've heard about like Germany in the 40s or whatever. They were on lists where like people would be like, yo, we're looking for this guy, and I know that you were in this photograph with him, so where is he? And people were like torture other people to try to find people on the list, and my parents were on that list. My dad was a big loudmouth liberal at a bad, inconvenient time. When I started to understand their past, I asked them, like, why did you guys choose to have a child at that time? Right? Like, I was born while they were literally on the run. Like, the town where I was born, they didn't have an address because they were just there for like 2 weeks while my mom gave birth, and she like healed a little bit, and they like hit the road again. So like they never like lived in a place in the town where I was born. Someday, if you want, I'll tell you really sad stories about all this. But I always ask my parents, like, or rather, I remember this one time I asked them, and I always wondered, like, why would you choose this? Are you kidding me? To have a child in this environment that's the opposite of how my wife and I planned. How reckless and how cavalier, and like, what were you thinking? And like, my mom didn't really want to talk about it much, and my dad kind of explained it in this way that I think you need to hear. My dad said that they were living at a time when everything around them was broken and dark, and they didn't have me for my sake. They didn't like make a child for the sake of the child. They say that they had me because they needed something to be happy about and something to have hope in. That for them, parenting was a way to survive in a time when the world was so dark and so scary, and they were just so sad. All their friends disappeared. Like, all the betrayal and all the tragedy, and like, they were like, you were the thing that kept us going, and we needed that. And I think it's important for us to remember that families are not strategic, cold endeavors, that we don't like bring out the calculator and figure out what the income is going to be. That's actually maybe the wrong way to think about family. And it's not the same for everybody. And I think that we have to be really careful how we talk about people's decisions. And we have to remember that there's love in families, and there's love in children, and there's a human angle when we talk about population issues. I hope you'll forgive me for the personal part of that. Okay. The end.